Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all, and great that you can join us for this discussion on NATO's strategic reflection after the US elections. My name is Rem Korteweg. I'm a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute. And I apologize, first of all, for the slight delay. One of our speakers is still en route, and we're going to try to bring him into the conversation as quick as we can, but we didn't want to keep you waiting, so we wanted to get started. Now, it's a special honor to be moderating this first joint event between the Clingendael Institute and the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And I hope that PISM and Clingendael are able to start a warm and rich tradition of doing events together and to facilitate the exchange of Dutch and Polish perspectives, including on issues related to international security. And with that, please allow me to give the floor to the director of PISM, Dr. Sławomir Debski. Sławomir, it's great that we were able to do this. Over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Rem. Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you for watching us. I'm really happy on behalf of the Polish Institute of International Affairs that we managed to put together this first joint seminar as a forward to bring foreign and security communities of our countries together, better understand each other, better communicate with each other, and to contribute jointly to more effective, more robust and active alliance. There is a widespread wisdom that nothing can be more antithetical than Dutch and Polish, respectively, security and defense perspectives. Netherlands are perceived as a classical sea power, bringing to the alliance, all this vision of generating naval force without serious threats and without any serious consideration about land aggression. While Poland is living in completely different security environment. We are being perceived, first of all, as a genetically anti-Russian animals, because we live exactly in the front line. Across of our border, we have to deal with 45,000 tank army preparing to launch land aggression against our country, supported by missile strikes, some of tactical, conventional kind, perhaps also nuclear. So our perspectives are completely different. However, both of them contribute to the security thinking of the alliance. We contributing to finding a kind of the common denominator between these two, as I said, antithetical positions, can make our alliance much stronger. So I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador Marisa Gerards, permanent representative of Netherlands to NATO. I hope Thomas Schatkovsky would join us shortly, and we'll have these official views on how these different perspectives contribute to each other, in the sense how they help to bridge the gaps that in strategic thinking of the alliance exist. I'm also like to congratulate Łukasz Jurczyszyn, who is running our Polish Institute of International Affairs Brussels office, established exactly for this purpose, to facilitate communication between expert communities, to understand each other thinking better, and in the end of the day, to help us to navigate over troubled waters of our times. So once again, thank you very much for doing this. I'm looking forward for another occasion, and it's great, absolutely, to cooperate with Clingendael.
Thank you very much, Slawomir. Let me very briefly introduce the speakers that you're going to be listening to. And the first speaker will be Permanent Representative to NATO, Ambassador Marissa Gerards. And Marissa Gerards is a career diplomat with the Dutch Diplomatic Service. She was appointed ambassador to NATO in the second half of 2018. And previously, she was ambassador to South Africa in Pretoria. And before that, the deputy political director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Secondly, hopefully, we'll have Ambassador Schatkovsky be able to join us. I will introduce him in a little bit more detail when he indeed comes online, but it's excellent that we have both permanent representatives of the Netherlands and Poland to join us. And subsequently, we will hear from our two think tank colleagues, both running the international security programs in their respective institutions. On the one hand, my close colleague, Dick Sondé, and secondly, Marcin Terlikowski from PISM. A very warm welcome to you both. Now, before we get started, let me also mention that from Clingendael's point of view, this is the final in a series of events that our newly established Clingendael Russia and Eastern Europe Center has been organizing this year, where we cover issues related to Russia, Eastern Europe, the spaces in between, so to speak, and NATO-EU affairs connected to the European security landscape. Now, the focus of our discussion today is on NATO's future in the context of the US elections, in the context of European strategic autonomy. And as I see it, there are three sets of issues that we should talk about. We've all seen the latest NATO 2030 report, the report that was recently published by the wise men and women tasked by the NATO Secretary General to think about NATO's future and its new potential strategic concept. That's one set of issues I think we can explore. What do we think about the NATO 2030 report in the context of new US leadership, in the context of this question of a new NATO strategic concept? Secondly, another set of issues has to do with what do we expect from the United States under a Biden presidency when it comes to NATO? What role is there for the United States in terms of European security? Phrased differently, how much damage has the Trump administration done to the perceptions of transatlantic security, and how will Europe respond in the context of its ongoing debate about European strategic autonomy? And finally, I think there's a set of issues connected to two specific security challenges that the alliance faces, which are, on the one hand, Russia, and secondly, or on the other hand, China. Both are oftentimes grouped together. The alliance should think about Russia and China. But of course, both are actually quite different and they require a different response. What do we expect? What should the alliance do? And is it doing enough? I see that Ambassador Schatkovsky has been able to join us. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to settle into this webinar and give Ambassador Gerards the chance first to offer her thoughts on these three issues. Ambassador Gerards, dear Marissa, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rem, for organizing this important webinar with your Polish colleagues, and thank you for giving me the floor. I understand I have about 5 minutes, so I'll try to watch the time. It's very nice to team up with our Polish friends. Very good to see my good friend Tomasz on the other side and the other colleagues. It's also very good to compare notes because, as you said, Slawomir, the geographical positions of our countries, but also our history is very different, and so also the way we look upon threats is also slightly different. Although we join the same alliance and together in a kind of 360-degree threat assessment, as we do within NATO, we join hands on a daily basis. I'm also very much looking forward to the questions from the audiences. So let's see what they have in store for us. Maybe I was thinking when I thought about NATO, I first thought of last year when we were celebrating our 70th anniversary, and our Secretary General, on a daily basis, he reminds us of the fact that we are the most successful alliance in history. And I was wondering, why is NATO so successful? And sometimes I think because we have a very short treaty of only 14 articles, that helps a lot. And that we are a value-based organization. So that means that we have the same kind of direction. But also I think, and many said it before me, the fact that we can adapt to new challenges and new threats. And we did quite a few times in the 70 years of history of NATO. It started as a collective defense organization for 40 years. We had to change at the end of the Cold War, taking new members on board, but also going out of area or out of business. So we could see that NATO was not only about, protecting our own territory, but also going to other places like former Yugoslavia. I think another wake-up moment was 9/11, where NATO had to adjust again, had to take on board other threats, non-state actors, terrorism, and NATO did. NATO adapted again to this new threat perception. And then I think again 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia was another moment for NATO to understand that they had to adapt real quickly or otherwise be out of business. And that was when we saw collective defense back on the agenda. We have the forward presence. It was very quickly decided and rolled out. And in doing so, I think we strengthened posture, and also we increase the readiness of our forces. But I'm sure that Thomas will say a few words on that. Now, I think NATO could adjust and could deliver. And I think we are again at a defining moment in time. We have to adjust again to deliver for our citizens. And I think the reflection group that you mentioned, Rem, of experts, they presented a very interesting report. And they gave us some very good recommendations on these new threats that actually we have to counter. By the way, the report is available. So for the people who are listening in, they can just get it from the internet. One of the first recommendations, and I think you mentioned it as well, Rem, is the update of the strategic concept. We have a strategic concept which gives the political framework for our cooperation, and it dates back to 2010. And we have to realize that actually it's outdated. Not all, but in parts. And already our Secretary General embraced the fact of updating the strategic concept. And also for us as the Netherlands, it's very important to have this joint political framework from where we work. What we will do, and let me just mention it real quick, because I'm sure that we get a little bit more into it in more detail. We have to redefine our relationship with Russia, because it's still considered a partner in the strategic concept of 2010. And we do see that this relationship changed in such a way that we have to redefine. China was not mentioned at all. And you said correctly, Rem, that it is on our radar now on a daily basis. Cyber, hybrid, new technologies, it's not being properly addressed. And I think we're going to take that all on board. I think also we see that arms control, the arms control regime in 2010 was much stronger than it is today. So that's also really different. So NATO will and must adjust again, and I think that's what's going. I think 2021 is about this adjustment. I think there will be another summit, and I think we will be tasked to update the strategic concept. Now, maybe if I can still, but I look at you, Rem, if I still have a few minutes to say a few words on the internal affairs and also on the elections in the United States, as you mentioned. I think our alliance is strong and united, notwithstanding the fact that we do have discussions and we do have differences, and sometimes they reach the newspapers as well. And I think this is just part of working with a diverse group of countries who are in different geographical locations. They have their own perspective, and so you have different concerns and you have to discuss. And I think during the 70 years, we already saw that sometimes we have these problems. And I think it's also an illustration of the fact that our societies have different political priorities. So I think it's important to discuss. I think it's important to consult. And I think it's important to unite at the moment when the going gets tough. And I think NATO always did. So I have no concerns there. Now we see in the US a new administration coming in, and that happens all the time because we are a democracy. So we see all the time that allies have other political leaders, and we have to adjust all the time. I think the US Biden administration is going to start in a month's time. I think they will have some other political priorities, such as multilateralism back at the core of American foreign policy. US will return to the WHO. They will embrace Paris Climate Agreement again. Maybe even a New START treaty will be extended. These are things that are already open in public, and these are things that we're very happy with. I mean, the Dutch government is. These are also issues that are very important for us, so we're happy with this. Of course, the Biden administration will also stress the necessity for burden sharing, and rightly so. The Will's commitment on the 2% defense expenditure is a solid promise, and we have to deliver, also my government. And Europe has to take on more responsibility. And maybe we get a little bit more into that in a minute. China is on the radar. It will stay on the radar, I think, as a partner, systemic rival, but also sometimes as a threat. We have to get our act together. We have to understand better what's happening, and we have to take measures. And so on the one hand, I think we will see under the Biden administration that multilateralism will be back, but we will also see that there's also continuity in other domains. And maybe let me also underline that the current administration, as well as Congress, there is bipartisan support for NATO, and we never doubted that. And maybe just to conclude with one thing that will probably change, and that is governing by tweet. I'm revealing no secrets, I think, when I confess that this was at times really difficult and challenging for us, because after all, consultations and predictability are very important for our work and to forge our unity. So let me leave it there, and I'm sure that we get back to other subjects. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gerards, for starting us off so expertly. I'd now like to turn to Ambassador Schatkovsky, but not before I give you a decent introduction to our audience, our participants in Zoom and on YouTube. For those of you who don't know Ambassador Schatkovsky, he has had a very distinguished career, both as a think tanker, as a politician, and as a civil servant. Between 2015 and 2019, he was the Deputy Minister of National Defense. He was in Poland. He was in charge of Poland's strategic defense review. And he was appointed as Polish ambassador to NATO a little bit more than a year ago in July 2019. Before I give you the floor, Ambassador Schatkovsky, let me also remind our viewers that this is a session which is on the record. We have people joining us in Zoom and in YouTube. For those lucky few in our Zoom environment, you also have the chance to ask your questions. If you have questions that you want to put to the panelists, please insert them in the Q&A function below. And with that, Ambassador Schatkovsky, over to you for your thoughts on those three sets of issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Korteweg. It's a privilege to be here with you. I hope that I'm being heard well. Yeah, okay, that's good. I apologize for joining in later. I had some minor technical problems, and but you know, I've managed to be on time to hear my good colleagues, Ambassador Gerard's presentation, and I can only say, you know, Marisa is one of the wisest voice in the NAC, so it's difficult to add much after her. But in a way, that makes my task a little bit easier. But before I go on, I just want to congratulate both think tanks for doing the project. I mean, it's important to maintain reflection on the in the track to zero. Let me just start with in the opposite sequence to my good colleagues. I'll start with the administration. I wouldn't overestimate the importance of the change. I think in spite of some visuals, in spite of some rhetorics, there will be more continuation than of a change. And I think it's good because in terms of the deeds, there was, I mean, a lot of good things also happened I expect the continuation of upholding values and common security interests. I expect also a reinvigorated emphasis on multilateralism and on even closer transatlantic cooperation. I hope that will resist the time and interest diversion stress test. I agree with my colleague Marisa on that burden sharing will continue to be stressed, and that China will remain a priority. When it comes to Russia, we expect a continuation of NATO's policy, which has been solidified in two recent summit conclusions. The dual track approach remains valid, and there is no really foundation to change it. It basically encompasses approaching possibility of dialogue with Russia with confidence stemming from the right deterrence and defense posture. We have to remember that we need the tool for tango, and it was Russia that proved to be unwilling to engage. But having said that, once Russia is ready to engage, we of course should be ready to engage as well, based on our policies and principles set so far. When it comes to the ADN dimension of relations with Russia, and this is, by the way, concerning both the administration and the strategic reflection process, strategic concept, we welcome the announcement of the extension of the New Start. We've always been of the view that it's better to start from something rather than from the scratch, although, I mean, we are aware of the shortcomings of the deficiencies of this framework. But we keep fingers crossed for the new administration to come to a good deal, which will also protect our interests. I just want to underscore that the ADN, the disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control agenda is important for Poland to the same degree as it is for the Netherlands. I know that we working together on the NPT issues and on the Hague on the promotion of the Hague of Code of Conduct, for instance, when it comes to the New Start. Reflection process. I think, yeah, it comes in the right time, although it was more or less, to some degree, crisis management exercise, but it was the right time to sit down and reflect on the political dimension of the alliance, because there was so much going on in the defense dimension, conceptually, first of all. The capabilities are still to follow. That we needed to reflect on how our mechanisms of political consultations, how our priorities, indeed, how we approach partners and adversaries, and the hierarchy, and in the current strategic concept is not really up to the current security environment. There's some good ideas on that, which we will reflect. To some degree, it's been just a refreshment of our instrumentarium, which was also useful. Very interesting ideas on the emerging and disruptive technologies, on strengthening partnerships, some new language, some new ideas on China, which in a way goes ahead of us, but I think that the Chinese importance is growing, so we'll have some good food for thought. And we all agree that there is a growing appetite for the new strategic concept. We are in a different place than we are in 2010, and this report gives us some good basis for that. If there's going to be a need, I may dive later on into some details, but I think experts will do it better than. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schatkovsky. About the new NATO strategic concept, it's I'm a historian by background. It's interesting to see that almost to the clock, every 10 years, NATO reviews its NATO strategic concept. And from that perspective, it seems like now is a very natural historical time to do it again. It also raises a number of questions, I think, also with respect to NATO-EU affairs. And I'd now like to turn to Marcin Telikowski to offer his assessment about potentially some of the challenges that revisiting the NATO strategic concept might lead to. And I'd also like to put, I mean, your director's question to you, which is that the Netherlands and Poland are seen to be antithetical. At least that was the term he used when it comes to our approaches to security. I don't know. I couldn't really make that out of the opening comments from both perm reps. I don't know how you see that, but Marcin, over to you.
Thank you, Rem. Thank you for having me. Indeed, I would like to focus on my kickoff couple of minutes on the European issue and the burden sharing, on the issue of the European strategic autonomy and the overall European ambitions in terms of defense. Because I think that if you agree, and we heard it from both ambassadors, Ambassador Schatkovsky, Ambassador Herz, that there is a discussion about China, there is a pretty much consensus that it's a systemic rival, but both security challenge in some areas and in some areas like trade, it is a partner with which both Europe and US will continue to deal, to trade, basically. And we've heard that there is, and I'm really glad to hear that being a Pole sitting here in Warsaw, that there is a consensus about holding policy towards Russia. Then I think that the question of what next for the European defense ambitions is the one which may add, let's say, some bad feelings. Hopefully not, but it may do it to the process of of drafting and negotiating the next strategic concept. And why is it so? Because I believe that we all know that the framework, the tissue for the EU-NATO cooperation at the staff-to-staff level has been vastly improved since 2016, since a joint declaration negotiated and signed during the NATO summit in Warsaw. And we have seen an unprecedented rise of common activities of both organizations, of exchange of information and coordination, synchronizations. I've just read yesterday that even when talking about PESCO, there's almost 40 PESCO projects which feed into the capability needs identified in NATO. So you may expect that things will go nice and smooth, and you will have this concept of European pillar in NATO rather than European strategic autonomy being developed as a reinforcement of European position in the burden sharing debate. Basically, Europe will start to deliver so that the discussion on burden sharing will be put on a different ground. And yet, I think that there will be temptations and that there will be factors driving a number of capitals, a number of political elites in some countries of Europe to capitalize on this investment. Because you got legitimate questions in the defense industrial field that if we are spending European money on the European Defense Fund, so why would you spend it on programs where you have American or non-EU companies? And indeed, European Defense Fund, which soon we've seen just a milestone here with another step made towards a final regulation of the EDF, it will not allow, the EDF will not allow funding of projects from European budget. At the same time, however, there is a bigger political issue, and it actually touches not only the PESCO and the EDF and the European Union defense initiatives, but it touches also the issues of China and Russia. So basically, what is Europe willing to do its own way, to quote High Representative Borrell? Basically, if we see too much focus on developing autonomous, if you wish, agenda of even parts of European Union member states, even parts of a group of European allies towards China, towards Russia, if we see attempts to, let's say, develop arms control and military transparency dialogue on a European or even a bilateral basis between Russia and European partners, bypassing what the US is doing and bypassing NATO, Russia Council, and bypassing the agreed language, we may see further strengths. And this is what I would be wary of, and this is something what I would closely look at. However, I believe that at the same time, and I'll be concluding now, this tissue, this fabric of European Union and NATO cooperation on an administrative level, and the growing understanding of the of the bare fact that Europe is not, and in short term will not be, self-sufficient in terms of deterring near-peer adversary, which Russia is, a nuclear power, which Russia is, that this understanding may lead us rather to implementing European pillar in NATO concept, as noted by the German presidency, rather than the ambitious vision of the European strategic autonomy, which might entail some kind of decoupling from the transatlantic link, and which would be a pity and detrimental to security of not only eastern flank but the entire Europe. And the rest, I guess, will come in questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcin. Dick Sandé, Marcin's point about Europe developing a pillar inside of NATO rather than having real strategic autonomy. I'm curious how you view that, also in light of what Ambassador Gerards mentioned regarding this question of European responsibility. Dick, over to you.
Thank you, Rem, and happy to join. I will say a few words on that in my second part. First, I want to say a few things on the report. I think it's an excellent report in terms of describing how complicated the world has become and will continue to be in the next decade or so. What I find disappointing about the report is what it implies for NATO. I think it falls short of that. Perhaps that is done deliberately because the debate still has to start, of course, in Brussels and in capitals. But let me provide two arguments why I draw that conclusion after reading the report. My first argument is, what are exactly the transatlantic relations? Of course, NATO is at the core of the transatlantic relationship, but there is much more than that. If we're talking about trade relations and related regulations and rules, if we're talking about financial matters, or not that in the least part, the big challenges in modern times of hybrid threats, the big technical networks and how to deal with them, all of that is not really on the NATO agenda in terms of action. Of course, it can be debated, but the action will be taken elsewhere. And the same applies to a certain extent to problems like China or Iran, which hasn't been mentioned so far. Again, the NATO Council is certainly the forum to discuss the security aspects of the relationship with China or with Iran. But in terms of action, if we're talking about sanctions or trade restrictions or measures on the digital world and other high-tech issues, decisions will be taken elsewhere, for example, in the European Union. So what I find missing in the report is that we need more or less a shared EU-NATO assessment of the international environment. That NATO has to recognize that the EU is much more than just a partner in security and defense matters. The EU has responsibilities across the whole of government, and that makes the other European organization, because I consider NATO also Atlantic European, of course, the most important partner for NATO. Furthermore, it might be worth considering a division of labor between the two organizations, where I can read in some of the national policies already that the EU is more equipped to deal with the South, which is different in terms of threat and challenges than the East. NATO, of course, remaining the prime organization, the only organization for collective defense. But at South, we have quite a few other set of problems where the broad instrumentarium of the EU is much more better suited to deal with those challenges. My second argument why the report falls short of my expectations is, in terms of implications for NATO, is what does the complexity of threats actually means in terms of responses. And the description in the report is absolutely to the point. We face challenges from classical military threats to non-military hybrid challenges, fake news, disinformation, other ways of interference in our societies and democracies, and it also refers to the impact of climate change, pandemics, and natural disasters. Again, that all of that can be discussed and should be on the NATO agenda. There are security and defense-related aspects to this. But of course, dealing with those items requires a way broader set of actors in capitals, other than the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense, but also internationally in terms of other organizations. So that about the 2030 report. My second item is, and follow up to what Marcin has been saying, is what should NATO be focusing on in the near future and how does this relate to the issue of European strategic autonomy, the discussion that is ongoing, and what can we expect from the Biden administration. Contrary to the Trump administration, of course, we can expect from Biden support to multilateralism, that the Biden administration will contribute to a more healthy, well-functioning transatlantic relationship, both in NATO, but also vis-à-vis the EU. That is fine. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin will reconstruct instead of destroy the transatlantic link with Europe, which basically has been the affair in the last few years, at least from the White House. At the same time, the Biden administration will require from Europe to continue investing more in defense and to take more responsibility for its own security. There I agree with Martin that there will be continuity and not much change. And that implies that not only the 2% GNP criterion on the input side, the money to be spent on defense will still be there after the 20th of January, but also in my view that the European countries have to deliver better on the output side and the capabilities that have to be produced to make this burden sharing better, not only in financial terms, but also in output terms. And there I see a great opportunity to combine what is going on in the European Union, the whole discussion on the European Strategic Compass, and the upcoming reflection in NATO on working towards a new strategic concept. If we combine those two, by defining something in Europe that allows for European autonomous action, which, by the way, as such is nothing new, only we have been doing it at a very low level in terms of operations, and we can connect that to the European contribution to NATO, which Martin refers to rightly as the European pillar in NATO, then I think we have a win-win situation. And we have the opportunity, because in the EU we have the strategic compass exercise up and running, and it will continue in the whole of 2021 and finish in 2022 under the French presidency. And at the same time, we have an exercise in NATO to start probably after the leaders' meeting at developing a new strategic concept. So if we can bring in the European definition of what we should be capable of doing ourselves, Europe, without any American support, and combine that to the European contribution to NATO, then I think we have a great win-win situation. And the Biden administration, I think, offers that opportunity, and that opportunity should not be missed. It's a golden opportunity we have now.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful comments, Dick. I'd like to pose some of your questions also to the permanent representatives, and particularly, I think, paraphrasing something you said, that I'd like to get the views of Ambassador Gerards and Ambassador Schatkovsky on, is this question of an EU-NATO division of labor. I mean, that seems to fall flat, given your analysis of what we need to deal with, for instance, the new types of challenges like with China. So you can't really have a division of labor and say the EU should focus on the South, the NATO should focus on the East, when it comes to a security challenge which has both a hard power element to it, say, for instance, in the Asia Pacific, but also very much more the hybrid challenges or the non-traditional security challenges, digital, cyber, energy, economic security, trade dependencies. The EU has a EU-US dialogue on China. The EU also presented a quite ambitious program to the new US administration called the EU-US Agenda for Global Change, which also has a significant chunk on China. What is NATO's response to that? Or can it piggyback on some of this? Or should it set up a China dialogue on its own? I'm curious what the thoughts of the perm reps are on this. Who can I ask first? Ambassador Gerards, perhaps you, and maybe you want to address anything that you've heard so far.
No, thank you very much for this question. And I mean, it's on the top of our agenda. EU-NATO cooperation of great importance. We are all convinced of that. These two organizations are part of the so-called political West. The Netherlands, Poland, we're a member of both organizations. So nothing is more natural than having them work together. And there is some kind of division of labor in the sense of NATO being the cornerstone of our security. So if we talk about collective defense, we will always look at NATO. On the other hand, EU also has to step up to the play. I mean, it's been expected as well. We can see that allies, and the US is one of them, are also looking at the EU and asking the EU to take better care of their own backyard. So I think strategic autonomy, and I'm here just echoing my minister, it's not an end goal in itself, but it means to achieve something, and to achieve something that the US is also expecting from us. And as we have only one set of forces, what we are doing in the EU will also benefit NATO. And that's a bit on the kind of conventional threats. And Rem, you rightly said so, that China is posing a whole different kind of threat to us. And we're all a bit wondering how we can best counter it. And we can see that threat is very often also through economic means, the economic coercion, the fact that their foreign investment is very often in critical infrastructure, the theft of intellectual property, the supply chains that was suddenly a problem when COVID hit Europe, resilient societies, the cyber, the hybrid. And these are all the new threats where the reflection group has some very good recommendations for NATO, but where we see that the EU is already doing a lot. Because as the threats are very often in the economic domain, the EU is better equipped, I would say, to look for an answer. And also the EU is a regulatory body. So some things the EU can do, NATO cannot. And we saw already, and I think Dick Sandé mentioned it as well. I mean, the EU has an impressive toolbox with sanctions in it, for example, something that that NATO doesn't have, but also to retaliate on trade restrictions if needs be. So the toolbox of the EU is filled and very interesting. But then again, NATO has a few very important and big partners on board, like the US, like UK, like also Norway, Turkey, and a few others. So it's only in our own interest to make sure that we counter these threats together. And therefore, I think EU-NATO cooperation is very high on our agenda. And we're actually looking at this moment in time also on subjects like China, how we can better work together and counter this threat.
Thank you. Ambassador Schatkovsky?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, Poland is also a strong proponent of robust EU-NATO cooperation, based mostly on the principle of complementarity. We have to also remember, however, that NATO, that EU represents a significant number of NATO nations, but not all of them, and there are also big NATO players who are outside of the EU. However, I would say when we are tackling this issue from the institutional perspective, I think that we are able certainly to come to a sensible compromise, and both organizations have proved that from time to time. For instance, with the Warsaw Declaration of, I think, 73 principles, there's a lot in the spirit of complementarity that both organizations could do. And of course, we cannot hide that there are some differences based also on different composition of both actors, and those are not so easy to overcome. Some of the blockages come basically from that. But going forward to the strategic autonomy, we don't really like this term in Poland. We think it's rather misleading, and because it implies we try to be autonomous from whom, and then the first idea is that we are trying to be autonomous from our transatlantic partners, and then why. So we prefer the spirit of complementarity, and perhaps some other terms, like I think strategic responsibility has been mentioned here, or resilience could be used instead. Nonetheless, I sometimes have a feeling that when such terms are being used, like strategic autonomy, or the discussion about the European army is being brought up again, I have a sense that it's more like a smoke and mirror for other issues that are in play. I would suggest concentrating on some good ideas that have been decided, like PESCO, like European battle groups, that should be put into use at last. And yes, yeah, thank you very much. I've also noticed there are some questions in the Q&A. So
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have a question which is actually nicely a follow-up to this issue of EU-NATO cooperation, and it's from a former colleague of mine. It's great to see that she's listening in, Margriet Drent, who currently works at the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and she asks, the reflection group recommends to develop a NATO equivalent of DARPA, or NATO equivalent of the EU's EDF, to encourage innovation in capabilities. What do you think about this recommendation? And aren't we perhaps running the risk of scattering scarce resources among various organizations in that way? I would add that NATO also has its Allied Command transformation still in Norfolk, which is also sort of forward thinking about capabilities. So aren't we reinventing the wheel is, I guess, how I would summarize that question. I don't know who wants to chip in on this. Perhaps one of our, okay, Ambassador Schatkovsky, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it may be a useful direction. I'm not entirely sure about the exact solution. I mean, certainly I would be in favor of something rather lean and utilizing existing structures rather than something resource heavy. And you were very much right to mention the ACT, which already has certain ideas. And if we are talking about new concept development, then certainly there should be more emphasis on that, on putting new concepts into use, on also expressing them in the NATO defense planning process. When it comes to funding new R&D and new developments, I would be in favor of linear structures, perhaps some venture capital mechanism that could utilize NATO's prestige rather than try to fund the entirely new projects. And by the way, there is of course this is another area for complementarity between the EU and the EDF and NDPP goals. Thank you.
Dick, can I ask this question to you too? I know that in your research you've also been looking at the European Defence Fund and PESCO and how to bring in third parties. How do you see this potential issue of reinventing the wheel on new concept development and technologies through NATO?
Sure. Well, I mean, the problem is not that the United States is not investing enough in research and development. The Europeans are not investing enough. And in particular, the Europeans are not investing enough together. I've worked on that for about 6 years in the European Defence Agency, and the figures are 20 years later astonishingly low. So that is still where we have to go the extra mile. And the EDF can help in that respect. That's a new tool, of course, that is now available, unfortunately with a little bit less money than originally proposed by the Commission. But at least it's a start, and I think we should use that fully. To build another institution, another structure, which is NATO-wide, doesn't make a lot of sense to me because it's going to duplicate. So we're going to get into a very difficult debate. But it brings in a very difficult issue, that is a transfer of technology, intellectual property rights from the US to Europe. And we all know that there is legislation in the States, the ITAR legislation, which makes it extremely difficult. So in my view, we have to fully invest in the European matter. Of course, I fully agree with those who argue for as open as possible to third countries' participation. That is a difficult topic in Europe. But that is, I think, the way to go. And I think the transatlantic cooperation should really focus on the NATO output, the capabilities, and there we have to settle this agreement between Europe and the US and get to ambitious targets. But the instruments you can use to come to that objective, they're partly going to rest in NATO, but partly they're also going to rest within the EU.
And Martin, I note that you also wanted to come in on this.
Very quickly, because this is a quite interesting issue. Well, I understand and I fully agree that duplicating and establishing a fund in NATO, a fund meant to support defense industrial cooperation and capability will be very difficult because NATO does not have the legal framework for that. However, if we bear in mind that by the very nature, European defense industries and American defense industries are competitors and they compete for both European markets, to a less extent American market, which is very much closed for European companies, but also in global markets, then if we say that we need a new opening transatlantic relations, that we need to settle the issue straight as regards European pillar in NATO, European strategic ambitions, as I call it, because I don't like the autonomy term too, then we need to have to think about something like, a flagship transatlantic defense industrial project or a research project, at least something which would be politically driven, which would help overcome the ITAR and generally arms export control related issues, but show on a political level that we can work at least in some niches, one or two together, American and European prime contractors, to work on something, on a solution for NATO, because that would be needed on a political level. That would be appeal, which would, change this bitter feeling, as we had from the US, that Europe is growing and will be investing in its defense industry for all the good reasons. So I think that regardless of the function, which I agree should be linear, we should think, and the decision makers should think about this kind of a move on which would regard technology and which would combine American and European companies and research maybe institutions to develop something, to work on some kind of technology, be it even a small niche, but something what you can wave with as a proof of changing nature of transatlantic relations, being more bold and more ripe for new kind of cooperation. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I'm just quickly looking at Ambassador Gerards, if you want to add to this.
Maybe just 2 sentences. I mean, it's clear that we have to put innovation at the forefront. And as Dick Sunday said, Europe has to catch up. So that's very important. But one way or another, I think Europe has to cooperate together with the non-EU NATO members. And the US is a big one. Somehow, I always feel that research, R&D, innovation, that scientists do find each other, and how we're going to organize it on the political side, we have to look at it, what's most efficient, where we actually foster and give a platform for cooperation. And I'm not sure if that's the best one. We still have to look at it, but that innovation is key. That's beyond doubt, I think.
Thank you very much. Moving to our next question, also from the audience. And you mentioned Turkey already, Ambassador Gerards. There's a question regarding the internal cohesion of the alliance, and looking forward, how does NATO achieve sufficient internal cohesion to deliver on its external ambitions? The question is from our colleague Bob Dane, and he writes, "Dear ambassadors, thank you for your insights." Well, one question on the alliance's internal cohesion. We have just seen additional US sanctions on Turkey over its purchase of S-400 missiles, and the EU is also threatening sanctions. In fact, it's already installed sanctions over Turkey's behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean. Does NATO have sufficient instruments at its disposal to manage these internal tensions, which arguably are making the alliance less effective and less coherent than it otherwise would be? Ambassador Gerards?
Yeah, well, yes, of course that's problematic and that's not ideal. And as you all know, I think from the newspapers, that was also the start of the reflection process. Where we decided to look at how we could actually do things in a different way, so that we can actually, even better foster that unity and that cohesion. And you can see, if you look at the report, it both looks at external threats and how we can update our strategic concept, but it also looks at the internal cohesion and unity. And of course, consultation is at the heart of it. On the other hand, there's also kind of a tradition within NATO not to burden the alliance and the overall aim of our joint security, not to burden it with bilateral problems. Because once that you start playing out bilateral problems within the alliance, it's a big problem. So this is on our radar. It's been discussed on a kind of regular basis at this moment in time. And I'm sure, like all the other times in history, and I think the first one that comes to mind is the Suez crisis in the 50s, where there was also a problem within between allies, among allies. And so it's been of all times, and it's on our radar. And I think this one will also be solved again. And having the Biden administration coming in will maybe also give a kind of a fresh view on how we can solve a few of these outstanding problems.
Thank you, Ambassador Schatkovsky.
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree, especially with the last sentence of Marisa. These problems require strong U.S. leadership and taking key actors from Europe on board. And of course, NATO has a place for that. It is a place, first of all, for the political consultation within the NAC. And I think for problems that were mentioned, we, of course, are critical of procurement of key capabilities from NATO's adversaries. It doesn't mean that NATO has instruments to exert some direct influence on such decisions, but certainly if followed up to a greater degree, that would have some consequences in exercises in a military dimension of the alliance. But I would certainly encourage to approach Turkey as an ally, for which certainly NATO is a good organization. Poland, as I've mentioned, well, shares some of the concerns, but at the same time we decided to deploy our contingent of the maritime patrol aircraft for the tailored assurance measures for Turkey, also to underscore and to assuage some of the concerns in Turkey that Turkey may not be treated as an ally. So I would also encourage to encompass such an approach in tackling such problems.
Thank you. Does either Dick or Marcin want to weigh in on this issue? Dick, go ahead.
Just a few additional remarks. I agree with the ambassadors that this is not a matter for NATO as an organization to settle. Although I recognize that, for example, the Secretary General played a useful role when there was the dispute between France and Turkey. And of course, the report was produced by the military authorities. But I mean, the Turkey issue will not be solved within the NATO Council. And it has to come internally from Turkey, basically. And hopefully the US, who have been, of course, on the back seat over the last few years, and itself had an extremely bad relationship with Turkey, hopefully under Biden, can pick up where it left 4 years ago. But there is an important issue here, and that is the security aspect. I don't mean security in security and defense term, but the safety security issue. If through the S-400 system, the Russians get access to the NATO air defense system, and this is the main point made by the Americans, it makes the NATO aircraft vulnerable, then of course we have a real issue within NATO. Primarily a military issue, but immediately becomes a political issue. And this is something I think that the Americans are very aware of. And this is actually the basis for the sanctions that have now been taken against Turkey. So this cannot go on. There is something that has to happen in the near future. And again, hopefully the Biden administration can play a helpful role there to prevent that this is going even further away from the NATO solidarity and the safety of the NATO air defense system.
Thanks. Marcin, any considerations regarding that?
This time very quickly. I just think that all the discussion about Turkey, leaving aside the analysis of the factual situation on the ground and the S-400 stuff, don't want to get into that. We don't have time for that, I guess. But actually, this is the best illustration of the problem which we need to avoid at all costs. You cannot have one outlook on the issue of Turkey when you speak in the EU hat and when you speak in the NATO hat. Basically, there should be more coherence in thinking about about Turkey on the side of a number of states which share the membership, basically, both in EU and NATO.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to one issue which looms large in discussions inside NATO, but we really haven't tackled it yet, and that is Russia. I think the question I'd like to put on the floor is NATO doing enough to develop its policy vis-a-vis Russia? And I'm going to use that as a segue to ask a question from one of the participants from, I hope I'm going to pronounce this last name correct. If not, I apologize. Arthur Kachprik. I'm sorry. His question is, do you see any chances for progress in arms control with Russia? And what goals and rules should guide efforts of NATO and its members with regard to arms control negotiations with Russia? Perhaps I can ask Ambassador Schatkovsky to weigh in on this first.
I will start with just a very simple principle. I think in NATO, we should approach the ADN efforts with Russia from the position which strengthens our deterrence and defense posture rather than, well, certainly not undermines it. Yeah? So we have to keep that in mind. The ADN is not a tool for itself. We are, by the way, very much strong and in favor of such instruments like treaties on nuclear disarmament, the Open Skies Treaty, other sort of transparency treaties like Hague Code of Conduct. When it comes to overall framework, this should be the approach we should be taking. So just one sentence.
Yeah. Ambassador Gerards?
Well, yes, I recognize what Thomas says. I mean, we have our dual track approach, where we say on the one hand, we need a very strong deterrence and defense. And on the other hand, we look for this engagement and we see where there is room to actually talk and negotiate and see if we can have deals in the area of arms control. For us as the Netherlands, that's very important. But of course, you need two parties to tango in the end, and that's what we have seen around the New START treaty as well. How the United States was engaging on trying to negotiate, and I think the incoming Biden administration will continue these talks as well. And it's not so easy at this moment in time because there are more parties. China is interesting to include as well in arms control, so that's new. We haven't done that before. And also there are so many different systems that you actually need a kind of an overall view on the whole arms control area in order to make real progress. And then make sure that it's also all verifiable, which is very important. So I think it will be high on the agenda for the Biden administration, and we are all the way behind them, and very interesting to see where that will lead us as well.
But perhaps for Dick, connected to this, to what extent do you expect this? To what extent do you expect NATO to really play a role in this, and to what extent is this simply a negotiation between the Washington and Moscow, or perhaps Washington, Moscow, and Beijing? I mean, I don't recall the Americans really bringing it to the North Atlantic Council when it decided to withdraw from INF.
Well, that might be true in the end because it's American nuclear weapons. And of course, the further we go to the strategic level, the more it solely becomes US. Of course, we still have nuclear weapons in Europe as well. The first thing that has to happen, of course, is the prolongation of the new START treaty, that's for sure. And it will extend very quickly by the end of February. So the Biden administration has about 1 month and a bit more to announce that. And I hope they will do, because I think that might be a turning point that will make possible in the future a follow-up to the new START treaty, but also below the strategic level to start negotiations with the Russians. I agree with those who are saying you have to do it from a starting point of your own strength. That is always the case, of course. But on the other hand, I think the Russians will have a great interest in new arms control deals. We're about to start a new round of, well, actually it's ongoing, of modernization of nuclear weapons. It will cost a tremendous amount of money. If you look at the figures of the US nuclear modernization program, it's tremendous, and the Russians will have to do the same. And I think both have really a big interest in trying to bring the cost as much as possible down. And one of the ways to do that will be new arms control negotiations. On the conventional side, of course, we also will need new agreements, I think, particularly risk reduction measures, because what we have been seeing over the last 5 to 10 years, violation of airspace, provocative behavior by Russian aircraft, all of that, I think, has to stop, and we need a whole new set of confidence and security building measures. They worked pretty well during the Cold War and the years immediately after. They're not working anymore. And that there is also a Russian interest, because all the risks that are taking place in each other's neighborhoods and close to each other's airspace or territorial waters or whatever, both sides have an interest to calm down the situation and agree to a new set of rules. And that clearly is a NATO-wide matter as well. The nuclear stuff also, but of course the Americans are clearly in the lead.
And Marcin, to you, this broader question of NATO's response to the Russian challenge. Are you satisfied with what's coming out of NATO headquarters these days, or would you ask for more?
Well, depends how you look on the issues, because of course we have seen a tremendous increase of security of the eastern flank countries in Poland with the decision from the Warsaw Summit on deploying the multinational battle groups in Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. We have seen a bilateral Polish-American defense cooperation bringing more American troops to underwrite NATO mechanisms and actually help and give some flexibility for NATO allies to execute plans and in the case of crisis and move the reinforcements which are needed. But at the same time, of course, a lot of has to be done, and I would start with saying that we need to do a lot of what we promised to do. And just to name a few things, is the nature of the multinational battle groups, which should be joined and enabled. So they need some force packages, some enablings, some logistical support, which still has not been decided, or maybe is decided but not yet implemented. We need to work on the issues like military mobility, or what is called in NATO's rare commanders rare area. So all the Western and Central European countries and the infrastructure needed to move reinforcements. And we need to work on non-military issues like resilience of not only our electronic networks from any actions which would be surely taken to lower our readiness and willingness to respond to a crisis if crisis actually develops with Russia in the eastern flank. But we need to improve also our resilience of our societies to fake news, to propaganda, to all the narratives which can be militarized and weaponized these days quite easily because of new technologies, because of social media and the ability to promote fake news and disinformation, manipulate thoughts. So yes, we are very happy, and I think that the Polish strategic community people very much appreciate what has been done over the last 5 years. But at the same time, we have a lot of homework to be done too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with an eye on the clock, I have the unfortunate task to bring this session to a close, but I want to give the two ambassadors one final option to address either any question that they weren't able to over the past hour or so, final thoughts, or perhaps leave us with a parting thought on what we can expect from Dutch-Polish security cooperation, since we are here in a Dutch-Polish format. Ambassador Gerards, I see you smile. That triggers me to give you the floor.
Well, yes, it will be a very important year, I think. We're dealing with the COVID crisis to start with. That is, of course, also a very serious threat to all of us. So we have to see how we're going to solve that one. We will have our summit, incoming Biden administration. We have our recommendations. We absolutely see and realize that this is a time where we have to adjust again to all the new threats where we haven't really found the exact answer. Not that we're not dealing with it, but to get it on a kind of a higher level, and also in a cooperation with the EU, I think there is some really important work that has to be done. So we will probably deliver that all in our strategic concept a year later. And as you rightly said, we have to hold hands with the EU, who are dealing with the same kind of strategic thinking at this moment in time. So I'm just looking forward to the new year, and I'm very happy that we have so many people who are tuning in. I'm also looking forward to work together with the think tanks and with academia, because I think from different perspectives we're looking at the same subjects, and I think we all have parts of pieces of the puzzle to look for the solution. So thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting us.
Our pleasure. Ambassador Schatkovsky, the final words for you then.
Thank you very much. I'll just pick up from the recent question, from the last question, because there was a notion expressed by one of us that maybe there wasn't enough in the consultation on the ADN matters from our US allies in the Council. And I think the Council has played that role very well in recent years, and we've actually seen a very robust consultation with the US on some of the ADN measures. Maybe not all of them, but on the New Star, we've had a very good series of consultations with Ambassador Billingsley, last one of them just yesterday. There was some joint action on the INF, which was, and I think it's very good that we approach it together as NATO. Let me also mention that Wes Mitchell, the former official of the outgoing administration, played a very important role in drafting the reflection process report. So therefore, looking to the new year, I would like to see continuity in good things and consolidation of certain good processes. Of course, if some atmospherics could be improved, and if the new administration could address that, this will only be possible. But it isn't like they have they don't have to pick up from anything. On the Polish and Dutch cooperation, I think this is not like it was. I understand expressed in the beginning that we are totally antithetical. I think in the NAC we agree more than we disagree, and certainly there is a room to look of what could be do together more practically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, let me draw our session to a close, but not before I thanked all of our speakers, Ambassador Gerards, Ambassador Schatkovsky, Dick Sandé, and Marcin Terlikowski for joining us. It was great to partner together with PISM on this joint webinar. As I said at the beginning, I hope it's the start of a very fruitful cooperation. And let me also underline what Ambassador Schatkovsky said at the end. I actually found a huge amount of complementarity and consensus in our Polish and Dutch assessments of where we are in the international and European security environment. And with that, thank you very much for tuning in. And I wish you all very happy holidays, and see you hopefully in 2021. Thank you very much.